I'm David Armstrong. I'm director of the School of Aquatic and Fisheries Sciences, and my expertise in this department are crustaceans, crab, shrimp, lobsters, a little bit of other invertebrates, but mainly those categories. Surprisingly, the Exxon Valdez spill did not have very much measurable impact on the crustacean resources. Most of the species of crab and shrimp live in very deep water. They're very long-lived species, and when we analyze the extensive data that we collected by many, many methods to capture all of the different life histories, and compared oiled to non-oiled sites in that system, there was virtually no measurable impact. In the Gulf of Mexico, we don't yet know the factual impact on the various species that comprise the major fishery resources. We know that public perception and the government's reaction were very dramatic in both cases and led to extensive closures of fishery grounds. So I think at one point over 37% of the federal fishing grounds were closed. And public perception, ramifications on food processors, food dealers, had a very dramatic effect on the industry. But in terms of the species themselves, we don't yet see extensive evidence that whole year classes or entire populations were in any sense lost. There is tremendous value in the crustacean fisheries of the Gulf of Mexico. I think the statistic is that half of the landed value of all species in the Gulf is attributable to shrimp. 3 species of shrimp that form the large trawl fisheries. And interestingly, however, only about 7% of U.S. consumption is provided by those wild-caught shrimp, which isn't to say they aren't important. They're of great high quality, naturally produced, so to speak. But in absolute dollars, it's a multi-million-dollar industry, hundreds of millions of dollars. In the Prince William Sound, one of the really surprising things that we discovered in analyses of the fishery data is what was called serial depletion of the stocks. And as it turns out, before the Exxon Valdez spill, virtually every major crustacean fishery in Prince William Sound had collapsed. So red king crab and blue king crab and Dungeness crab and several species of shrimp, all were developed as fisheries, all were exploited, the catches went up, and then they were effectively overfished. So one of the oddities was, despite the very dramatic phenomenon of the oil spill, if it could have had an effect on the crustaceans, a fishery effect had occurred prior to that event itself. It's really difficult to quantify the effects of impact from something like an oil spill on a crab or a shrimp. And in Prince William Sound, we used every gear in every way possible, and to call it something conservative statistical approach to try and measure that effect. We found there was no measurable effect, but there's great uncertainty about the nature of data and the statistical validity of them. The trouble is that these are such tortured, convoluted, deep systems, so hard to sample. The very nature of the reproduction of these animals can bring larvae in from hundreds of miles away from different sources, so that loss of an adult in an area is conceptually replaced from an upstream source. It is hard to measure impact, and I suspect that in the Gulf, again, the most demonstrable impact comes via public perception and federal regulatory concern that it's smarter as first reaction to back people away from any prospect of contamination, even if, in fact, ultimately it's not there. And with time and monitoring, data will come in to verify whether, in fact, portions of area and product therein are fit to eat. And the federal government, in the case of the Gulf, has reopened an extensive amount of the original area closed. I think if 37% had been closed down in May and June last year, there is less than 11% closed at the present time. I don't think that aquaculture should be evoked as an alternative or remedy for replacement of natural production after a disaster like the Gulf oil spill. And it's very much the issue that has come to the fore in the last couple of decades regarding salmon and salmon hatchery. What's the right use for those kinds of augmentation? Natural production, it seems to me, is always desirable because to the extent it is at healthy levels, at historic levels, it seems to speak to the health and integrity of the ecosystem. So that's a great benchmark. The fisheries are healthy, the ecosystem is healthy. However, world fisheries, we're told from numerous sources, have maxed out. The production is at a peak, the demand grows, and so any difference henceforth will be attributable to culture production. And it can be done very responsibly, and it can be done with horrific consequence. So when you look at the Monterey Bay Aquarium food card, as you sit in the restaurant and sort down the green, yellow, and red columns, a lot of times species that are highlighted as ones we ought to avoid are those cultured. So in the case of shrimp, and that statistic of only 7% of U.S. consumption coming from the wild ones caught in the Gulf itself, and that huge fraction that's imported, virtually all of it is cultured. A lot of it very badly so. In semi-tropical countries, the ruination of mangrove habitat to modify shoreline, put in ponds, is just a terrible process at destruction of great natural ecosystem services that benefit so many other aspects of those communities that you wouldn't want to eat shrimp or whatever it might be farmed in that fashion. And yet there are worldwide very good, greener versions of aquaculture, and those are going to ramp up more than they are now if we keep eating seafood meals to the extent we are. The people of Washington State, I think, are really fortunate to have an extremely conscientious state regulatory agency. And in this state, as you know, there were federal decisions that allocated tribal rights to those nations that were reminiscent of the salmon decisions. So management is a very complicated process in this state. I was part of a team reviewing how that management is done, and I was really struck with the intensity, the sincerity of how the state fishery management agencies tries to hear, listen, and enact regulations that, to the best of their ability, are for the benefit of all parties. We have recreational fishers, tribal fishers, commercial fishers, and it's a tough number of constituencies to balance and make happy to the degree you can. My impression is that they work wholeheartedly and very sincerely to make fisheries sustainable, at least the crustacean fisheries I'm familiar with in this state.